An unfaithful wife brought her lover to her husband's funeral, certain he had lost his battle with cancer, without ever knowing of her betrayal. All she wanted was to uncover what he had left her as an inheritance. But what she didn't know was that her husband, shortly before passing, had planned one last unimaginable surprise. When she discovered what it was, she began to break out in a cold sweat. Edward Reed had always believed that his love for Susan and Michael was the solid foundation of his life. Indianapolis, with its wide streets and well-kept parks, was the perfect backdrop for the home he had built with such dedication. Over 20 years of marriage, Edward sacrificed personal dreams and ambitions to ensure that Susan had the comfort she desired, and that Michael, now 14, grew up surrounded by opportunities. A mechanical engineer, Edward had always been passionate about inventions. His small basement workshop was a refuge where he transformed ideas into projects, though he had never aspired to fame or wealth from his talent. For him, true fulfillment lay in his family, or at least that's what he believed. In recent months, Edward had noticed that something felt off. Susan, who once seemed attentive and present, now lived distracted, her phone always within reach and ready with an excuse for her increasing absences. He tried to ignore the signs, attributing the changes to the natural wear of the years. After all, there was no reason to doubt a woman with whom he had shared 2 decades of life. But then came the diagnosis. It was a routine appointment that revealed the tumor. The doctor, in a professional and measured tone, informed Edward that he had only a few months to live. The cancer had advanced aggressively and silently, and the available treatments would only delay the inevitable. Edward heard the sentence in silence, feeling as though the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Death, which had seemed so distant, was now at his door. That same day, returning home earlier than usual, Edward found Susan in the kitchen, talking on the phone. Her tone was soft, almost playful, something he hadn't heard in a long time. Curious and worried, he remained silent, listening to the words that would confirm his suspicions. "Yes, Logan. I can't wait either. Tomorrow after work, is that okay? I'm so looking forward to it." The name Logan echoed in Edward's mind like a blow. He knew Logan was one of Susan's colleagues at the office, a younger and attractive man who, it seemed, had taken the place that had once been his. Edward said nothing. He simply went upstairs, feeling an unbearable weight in his chest. The pain of betrayal was as strong as the impact of the diagnosis. Susan, the woman he loved and for whom he had sacrificed so much, was sharing her days, and likely her nights, with another man. But Edward was not the impulsive type. He didn't confront her. Instead, he sat in his workshop, staring at the old pendulum clock he had inherited from his grandfather. At that moment, an idea began to take shape. His days were numbered. There was no way to change that, but he still had control over how he would use the time he had left. If Susan had chosen to share her life with another man, he would choose to spend his final moments creating something that would leave an eternal mark. It wouldn't just be a mechanical project, it would be a legacy, a symbol of the time he had dedicated to his family and the lessons he wanted to leave for Michael. Edward began working on the clock that very night. The sound of the pendulum swinging filled the basement with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. Every piece was adjusted with meticulous precision, every detail planned with a greater purpose. He created hidden compartments, concealing letters he wrote during the early hours of the morning. In these letters, he shared his most cherished memories, reflections on life, and messages that would be gradually revealed, challenging whoever read them to confront truths they would rather ignore. While Edward worked in secret, the dynamics of the house continued to shift. Susan stayed out later and later, justifying her absences with work meetings or social engagements. Michael, on the other hand, began to sense that something was wrong. His father seemed increasingly tired, but still spent hours in the basement, while Susan acted as though everything was normal. Michael was a sensitive and curious boy, with a special bond with his father. He often went down to the workshop asking what Edward was building. "It's a very special clock," Edward would say, revealing no more. "One day, you'll understand why it's so important." Michael accepted his father's answers, but his teenage intuition told him there was more to the story. He watched Susan with growing suspicion, noticing her furtive glances at her phone and the subtle changes in her expression when she thought no one was looking. The tension reached its peak a few weeks before Edward's death. He called Susan for a conversation in the living room while Michael was in his room. Sitting in the armchair that had once been his favorite spot, Edward looked more fragile than ever. "I just want to ask one thing, Susan," he said, his voice low but firm. Susan crossed her arms defensively, as if anticipating an accusation. "What is it?" "When I'm gone, I want this clock to stay in the living room. It means a lot to me." Susan looked at the object with disinterest. To her, it was just another of Edward's eccentricities, something she would get rid of as soon as she had the chance. But she knew that agreeing was the easiest way to end the conversation. "Sure, Edward, if that's what you want." At that moment, Edward knew that Susan had no idea of the clock's true purpose. He also knew that as long as she underestimated it, his plan would remain safe. When the end finally came, it was swift. Edward spent his last days surrounded by Michael and a few close friends, while Susan remained distant, limiting herself to a convenient posture of mourning for someone eager to move on with her life. The funeral was a spectacle of appearances. Susan shocked everyone by arriving with Logan, as if he were just another guest. Michael, devastated by the loss of his father, looked at his mother with disbelief and disgust. The relationship between them, already strained, completely collapsed that day. After the burial, Susan returned home, relieved to close a chapter she considered a burden. She looked at the clock in the living room, curious about why Edward had been so insistent about keeping it there. For a brief moment, she thought of getting rid of it, but a nagging doubt made her hesitate. When she finally activated the clock's mechanism, driven by curiosity and a desire to uncover some hidden secret, the soft sound of the pendulum filled the room. The melody that followed was delicate, but carried something unsettling, and then a compartment opened, revealing the first letter. Edward's words were direct. "Susan, time cannot be bought, traded, or inherited. It is lived. What you chose to do with our time together will be remembered far beyond coins or possessions. And this clock, my final gift, was made to remind you of that." Susan froze, holding the letter with trembling hands. The clock, which she had imagined to be just another object, had become something far more powerful, a relentless mirror of her choices. Susan had always been a practical woman, focused on results. When she met Edward, she was captivated by his calm demeanor and determination. He was a man without extravagant dreams, but with an almost obsessive dedication to what he deemed important. This trait, which initially attracted her, gradually began to irritate her. To Susan, the world was about constant movement, about people striving for more than the basics. Edward, however, seemed content with little: a comfortable home, a loving son, and personal projects that rarely brought financial returns. Yet Edward loved Susan deeply. He did everything in his power to ensure she felt valued, even if it meant setting aside his own ambitions. He took well-paying jobs that didn't challenge him intellectually, solely to sustain the lifestyle Susan appreciated. When Michael was born, Edward saw fatherhood as an opportunity to channel his creativity and patience into something even greater, shaping the future of a son who, he hoped, would carry forward his values and talents. Michael was indeed a reflection of the best parts of Edward. At 14, he displayed a natural curiosity about the world and an impressive knack for understanding how machines and devices worked. He often spent hours in the basement with his father, watching him disassemble and reassemble gears and systems. For Edward, these moments were precious. He saw in Michael the continuation of what he himself might never complete. Conversely, the relationship between Susan and Michael was more distant. Susan loved her son, but there was something unsettling about how much he resembled Edward. It was as though Michael had inherited not only his father's talents, but also his simplistic view of life, something Susan found naive. To her, the world was far more complicated than Edward and Michael seemed to understand. As the years went by, Susan began to feel a void she couldn't explain. Despite having a stable home and a husband who did everything to please her, something was missing. This emptiness led her to seek solace in small distractions, outings with friends, luxurious dinners, and eventually Logan. Logan was the opposite of Edward in nearly every way. Young, ambitious, and full of energy, he made Susan feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. At first, she tried to rationalize the relationship as something harmless, a temporary escape. But over time, Logan became a significant part of her life, a constant presence that filled the gaps left by her marriage. Meanwhile, Edward continued working on the clock, increasingly aware that time was slipping away. He knew the project had to be more than just a machine. It was a testament, a way to communicate when he was no longer there. The letters he concealed within the clock's compartments were written with care, each word chosen to provoke deep reflection. Some were addressed to Michael, offering life advice and messages of love. Others, however, were directed at Susan with a cutting honesty he had never expressed in life. You brought another man into your life while I, day after day, chose to spend my last moments creating something for you and Michael. Time doesn't return, Susan, and when it's gone it takes everything except regret. Edward knew these words would be painful, but he also believed they were necessary. He wanted Susan to understand the impact of her choices, not as revenge, but as a lesson she might spend the rest of her life learning. As Edward focused on the clock, Michael began to notice changes in the household. He couldn't understand why his mother seemed increasingly absent, or why his father spent so much time isolated in the basement. There was a tension in the air that made him uneasy. One particularly quiet night, Michael went down to the workshop and found Edward sitting before the clock, watching the pendulum swing. "Dad, why are you working so much on this?" Michael asked, sitting beside him. Edward looked at his son, his face weary, but his eyes filled with tenderness. "Because sometimes, son, we have to create something that speaks for us when we can't speak anymore." Michael didn't fully understand, but he felt the depth of his father's words. He knew something important was happening, but he couldn't predict the impact the clock would have on their lives. Meanwhile, Susan continued living her double life. She did her best to keep up appearances, but her guilt grew with each passing day. It wasn't just the weight of her affair with Logan, it was also the feeling that in some way, she was destroying something Edward had built with so much love. The situation reached a critical point when Susan received news of Edward's diagnosis. She was in shock, but not for the reasons she should have been. Her mind immediately turned to how this would affect her life and her choices. When Logan learned of the situation, he began to distance himself. He didn't want to be involved in something so complicated and emotionally fraught. Susan, however, wasn't ready to let him go. "You don't understand," she said during a conversation with Logan, almost pleading. "He's already dying. This doesn't change anything between us." Logan looked at her coldly, his expression making it clear that he saw things very differently. "It changes everything, Susan. I don't want to be the guy who destroyed a family while the husband was dying." Logan's rejection was a blow to Susan. She felt lost, torn between guilt and the desire to maintain control over her life. But at the same time, something about the clock deeply unsettled her. She didn't understand why Edward insisted so much that the object remain in the house, but she sensed there was more to it than met the eye. The night before the funeral, Susan sat alone in the living room, staring at the clock. The pendulum swung gently, its sound filling the room with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. She approached, trying to understand what was so special about the object, but no matter how much she looked, she couldn't find any clues. The next morning, as friends and family gathered to say their goodbyes to Edward, Susan did something that shocked everyone. She arrived at the funeral hand in hand with Logan, as if publicly declaring that she had already moved on before the loss had even fully occurred. Michael, seeing the scene, felt a wave of anger and shame. He couldn't bear to stay in the same space as his mother. After the funeral, he decided he couldn't live in that house anymore. He asked to move in with his paternal grandparents, leaving Susan alone with her choices. Back at home, Susan finally decided to activate the clock, driven by curiosity and the hope that it might hold something beneficial for her. When she turned the small hidden key, the melody that emerged was both beautiful and unsettling. When the first compartment opened, revealing a letter from Edward, she realized there was far more to the object than she had ever imagined. When Susan finished reading the first letter from the clock, a chill ran down her spine. Edward's words were direct, but carried a depth she wasn't prepared to face. For the first time, she realized that the clock wasn't just a decorative object or a sentimental whim. It was the final act of a man who knew every corner of her soul and who, even after death, was determined to be heard. The weeks after the funeral were marked by an immense emptiness in the house. Michael was no longer there. His absence was a painful reminder of the chasm that now existed between mother and son. Susan tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy, but the sound of the clock, the soft swinging of the pendulum, the echo of the melody she occasionally activated, seemed to fill every corner of the house with a suffocating presence. On one particularly silent night, Susan decided to activate the mechanism again. She wanted to believe that somehow the messages Edward had left might offer something useful, perhaps even something financial. After all, he had spent so much time on that clock, hiding compartments and writing letters. There had to be more than just words. When the second compartment opened, Susan found another letter. This time the message was more personal, more cutting. "Susan, I didn't write these words to hurt you, but to remind you of what we once were. There was a time when our love was the most important thing in the world to both of us. I still remember the day we said our vows, when we promised to face everything together. You were the most important choice of my life, but I wasn't yours. And now, with the time I have left, I wonder, at what point did that stop being enough for you?" Susan let the letter fall to the floor, unable to continue reading. The words struck her like a blow, because they were true. She remembered how she had felt at the beginning of their marriage, when everything seemed possible, when Edward was the man who could make her smile with just a glance. But routine, their differing views on life, all of it had piled up until she allowed herself to seek something outside their marriage. In the days that followed, Susan avoided the clock. She walked past it without looking, as if the object had eyes that followed her. But the constant sound of the pendulum was an inescapable reminder. The clock seemed to have a life of its own, always present, always waiting. Meanwhile, Michael found a sort of refuge at his grandparents' house. He spent hours in his grandfather's basement, exploring the tools and parts Edward had left behind. For Michael, his father's work was a direct connection to his memory. He began dismantling old objects and creating small devices, inspired by what he had learned from Edward. One afternoon, while rummaging through a toolbox, Michael found a notebook his father had used to jot down ideas and projects. Among the technical drawings and mechanism diagrams, there were small messages addressed to Michael. "Son, never underestimate the power of time. It is everyone's greatest ally and greatest enemy. Use it well." Michael felt a surge of emotion as he read those words. It was as if Edward were still there, guiding him, helping him find purpose amid the pain. He decided to use what he had learned from his father to create something that could help others, something that would have a real impact. While Michael grew from Edward's legacy, Susan began to face the consequences of her choices. Logan, who had distanced himself after the funeral, disappeared completely from her life. He didn't answer her calls and avoided any interaction. Alone, Susan began to realize that Logan had never been the solution she had imagined. One night, driven by loneliness and desperation, Susan activated the clock again. The melody echoed through the house, as beautiful as it was painful. Another compartment opened, revealing a new letter. "Susan, while I spent my final days creating this clock, you chose to spend yours with another man. I can't change what happened, and neither can you, but I want you to know that while you sought something outside of what we had, I chose every day to keep believing our family was worth it. Time doesn't come back, Susan, and the choices we make are what leave our mark on the world." Susan felt a tightness in her chest. With each letter she read, Edward's presence became more vivid in her mind. He wasn't confronting her with anger or vengeance, but with a sincerity that forced her to face the truth about herself. In the days that followed, Susan began to notice small changes in her behavior. She avoided the social gatherings that had once been her escape and spent more time at home, surrounded by memories she couldn't push away. The clock became a central part of her routine, an object she both feared and needed. Meanwhile, Michael began to excel in the work he was doing in his grandparents' basement. He developed a prototype of a simple yet innovative device that helped people with motor difficulties perform everyday tasks. The device caught the attention of a local teacher, who encouraged him to enter a science fair. Michael hesitated at first, but decided it was what Edward would have wanted him to do. He threw himself into the project with renewed dedication, refining the design and adding elements that reflected his father's teachings. Susan, on the other hand, continued to grapple with the letters and the emptiness that expanded around her. The clock, with its constant sound, was an unrelenting reminder of the choices she had made and the opportunities she had lost. One night, Susan found one of the letters Michael had accidentally left at the house. It was a note written by Edward, full of love and pride for his son. As she read it, Susan felt a deep pain. She realized she had lost not only Edward, but also her connection to Michael. The conflict within her grew each day. Susan knew she needed to face the consequences of her actions, but she also knew it might be too late to recover anything she had lost. Susan spent her days trying to maintain a routine that seemed normal, but the clock in the living room was a constant presence that kept her tethered to the past. The sound of the pendulum echoed in her ears, even when she wasn't in the room. It felt as though Edward was there, watching her, forcing her to confront what she had done. Each new letter that emerged from the clock's hidden mechanism stripped away a layer of her carefully constructed mask, exposing her to regret and guilt. Michael, on the other hand, grew increasingly close to his paternal grandparents. Margaret and Joseph Reed, kind and simple people, became the emotional anchor he needed. They shared stories about Edward that Michael had never heard before, painting a picture of a man who, despite his limitations, always sought the best for those he loved. "Your father was a good man, Michael," Margaret said one afternoon while baking cookies. "He could be stubborn, but he always put others first. You've got that from him." Michael felt a wave of pride and sadness hearing those words. The weight of honoring his father's legacy felt enormous, but he was determined to carry it. Back at Susan's house, the loneliness began to deepen. Logan, who had once seemed like the solution to her dissatisfaction, had vanished entirely from her life. Susan tried contacting him several times, but her messages went unanswered. She wondered whether he had realized the chaos she embodied or simply grown tired of her. One night, while searching through a cabinet for something to distract herself, Susan found an old photo album. She sat on the couch and began flipping through it, seeing images of her life with Edward and Michael. There they were at Michael's 5th birthday, by the lake during a summer trip, smiling at the camera. The Susan in those photos seemed almost unrecognizable, happy, genuine, connected to her family. She cried silently as she looked through the images, feeling the weight of all she had lost. The clock, with its constant and relentless sound, seemed to mock her. She knew more letters were hidden within, waiting to be discovered, but she didn't have the courage to activate the mechanism again. While Susan wrestled with her demons, Michael continued to move forward. He was invited to present his prototype at the science fair, and the experience filled him with a mix of nerves and excitement. He wished Edward could be there to see him, but knew that, in a way, his father was present in everything he did. Michael's presentation was a success. He won first place and attracted the attention of local investors interested in funding the large-scale production of his device. When he returned to his grandparents' house that night, he felt a joy he hadn't experienced in a long time, but something still bothered him: the distance between him and Susan. Despite everything that had happened, Michael still missed his mother. He couldn't simply erase the good memories they had shared before everything fell apart, but the hurt ran deep, and he wasn't sure if he could forgive her. As Michael pondered his relationship with Susan, she finally gathered the courage to activate the clock again. The melody it played seemed longer, sadder this time. When the compartment opened, the letter she found was more devastating than the previous ones. "Susan, I imagined that one day you would sit here alone reading these words. You can blame the circumstances, blame the routine, blame whatever you want. But deep down, you know it was your choices that brought us here. What you do now won't change the past, but it can define how you'll be remembered. By me, by Michael, by the time you still have." Susan clutched the letter to her chest, unable to hold back her tears. Edward's words were like a mirror, reflecting exactly who she had become. For the first time, she began to wonder if there was anything she could do to regain even a small part of what she had lost. As Susan spiraled deeper into self-reflection, Michael received an unexpected email. It was from Susan. She didn't call or text, perhaps knowing he wouldn't answer. In the email, she asked to meet him but made it clear she would understand if he refused. Michael hesitated. Part of him wanted to ignore the request, but another part, a deeper part connected to what Edward had always taught him, told him he needed to hear what Susan had to say. They met at a cafe near his grandparents' house. Susan looked nervous, fidgeting with her hands as she waited for Michael to arrive. When he walked in, it was as if the air in the room shifted. "Thank you for coming, Michael," Susan said, her voice hesitant. He didn't respond immediately, but sat down and looked at her, waiting for her to speak. I know I ruined everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say this in person." Susan paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Your father was an incredible man. I know I didn't deserve the love he gave me, and I know I don't deserve a place in your life either, But please don't let what I did take that away from you. He always believed in you, Michael. And I do too." Susan's words were sincere, but Michael still felt the weight of his hurt. "I know you're trying, Mom, but it's not that simple. You didn't just destroy what you had with Dad. You destroyed what you had with me." Susan lowered her head, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I know, Michael." The silence between them was heavy, but there was something different about it. For the first time, they both seemed willing to face the truth without running from it. When the meeting ended, Michael returned to his grandparents' house, his mind filled with thoughts. He still didn't know if he could forgive Susan, but he realized that regardless, he needed to move forward. Susan went back home, and for the first time in weeks, sat before the clock without fear. She knew more letters were hidden inside, and understood that each one would bring a new layer of truth she needed to confront. Susan's days had become a routine of loneliness and regret. She spent more and more time sitting in front of the clock, as though expecting it to reveal answers to the questions that haunted her. The letters she had found so far brought back memories of the past and painful reflections on her choices, but something else unsettled her. Susan felt that she still hadn't uncovered everything Edward had planned. Meanwhile, Michael continued his journey of self-discovery and growth. The prosthetic project he had presented at the science fair had attracted more attention than he had anticipated. He was now in contact with a local startup, interested in investing in his idea and turning it into a real product. While he was excited about the possibility of impacting lives, Michael couldn't shake the thoughts that connected him to his father, and by extension, to his mother. The distance between Susan and Michael remained intact, though a fragile thread seemed to slowly pull them closer. Susan continued to send occasional messages, sometimes congratulating him on his progress, other times sharing memories of Edward. Michael read the messages but rarely responded. The wound caused by what Susan had done still felt raw, and part of him resisted the idea of reconciliation. It was on an ordinary day, seemingly without significance, that Susan activated the clock's mechanism again. This time, the melody was longer and more enveloping. When the compartment opened, she found not a letter but a golden key. The key had a small note attached to it. "Susan, this key unlocks the clock's final secret. Wait until the anniversary of my death. Time is a circle, and some answers only make sense at the right moment." The message sent a chill through Susan. Edward's death anniversary was only a few days away, and the idea that the clock held one last secret left her torn between fear and curiosity. She tried to occupy her mind with trivial tasks, but the key seemed to call to her constantly. That same day, Michael received an email that caught him by surprise. It was from Susan. This time she didn't apologize or try to explain herself. Instead, she spoke about the clock. "Michael, I know you have every right to hate me, but I want you to know there's something your father left for us. The clock still holds one last secret. He asked me to wait until the anniversary of his death to open it, but I feel this is something you should witness. If you can, please come. If you don't want to, I'll understand." Michael read the message several times before deciding what to do. He hesitated, thinking of all the reasons not to go, but deep down, something inside him wanted to be there, not for Susan, but for Edward. On the anniversary of Edward's death, Susan prepared the living room with a simplicity that felt almost ceremonial. She placed a chair in front of the clock and set the golden key on a nearby table. Then she sat down and waited. When Michael finally arrived, Susan felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. He entered silently, greeting her with a brief nod before sitting next to her. "Thank you for coming," Susan said, trying to keep her voice steady. Michael merely nodded, not looking directly at her. The clock's melody began when Susan turned the key in the hidden mechanism. It was a more complex tune, as if each note carried a story. When it ended, the clock projected soft lights across the walls of the room, forming images that captured important moments in Edward's life. They saw photos and short videos of Edward holding Michael as a baby, laughing with Susan during happy times, and working in his workshop with a gleam of joy in his eyes. Each image was a reminder of the man who had been the glue of their family, the center of everything they had now lost. At the end of the projection, a final message appeared on the wall. "Susan and Michael, this is my farewell. The time I spent with you was the greatest gift of my life, even with the challenges we faced. Susan, I hope you find a way to use the time you still have meaningfully. "Michael, my son, never forget that the world needs your kindness and intelligence. I will always believe in you. With all my love, Edward." Michael felt a wave of uncontrollable emotions. Tears streamed down his face as he watched his father's final message. Susan beside him cried silently, clutching the golden key in her hands. After the projection ended, the clock emitted one last sound like a sigh before falling completely silent. Susan looked at Michael, searching for something in his eyes, but he said nothing. He simply stood up and walked toward the door. "Michael, wait," she called out, her voice choked. He stopped but didn't turn around. "I know I ruined everything, and I know I'll never be able to undo what I did, but please, never forget that your father believed in you. He always saw the best in both of us, even when we didn't deserve it." Michael remained silent for a few seconds before walking out the door, leaving Susan alone with the clock. That night, Susan sat in front of the object that had consumed so much of her attention in recent months. She wondered if there was still something she could do to repair the damage she had caused, but she knew it might already be too late. The turning point brought devastating clarity for both of them. For Michael, it was a reminder that Edward's legacy lived within him, and he had the responsibility to carry it forward. For Susan, it was the final blow, a message that confirmed what she already knew. The choices she had made had left deep and lasting scars, and the time she had left would be lived under the weight of those decisions. The living room seemed quieter than ever after Edward's final farewell. The clock, now motionless, appeared to have fulfilled its purpose. Susan sat there for hours, staring at it as though waiting for it to speak again, to give her some direction. But all that remained was the emptiness. Michael, meanwhile, left his mother's house with a heavy heart. His father's last message had ignited something within him, not just the pain of loss, but also a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he had to carry on the work Edward had cherished so deeply. Yet the strained relationship with Susan remained an open wound. In the days that followed, Michael threw himself into his projects. The device he had created was finally taking shape as a viable product, and financial support from investors who believed in his idea began to flow. The work became a way to channel his emotions, a means to honor Edward's memory. Despite his professional progress, the hurt caused by Susan's actions lingered. He still remembered the day of the funeral, Logan standing beside her, and the weight of her betrayal. Even Edward's final words, which seemed to offer a path toward reconciliation, couldn't erase the damage that had been done. Susan, on the other hand, began to confront the consequences of her actions more directly. The absence of Michael in her life had become unbearable, and she realized she had no one to blame but herself. She tried to maintain contact, sending occasional messages, but most went unanswered. One morning, while sorting through what remained of Edward's belongings, Susan found a box he had left in the basement. Inside were tools, technical drawings, and one final letter. It was short, but direct. "Susan, if you found this, it means you're still searching. Don't let the time you have left be wasted like the time we lost. Find something worth dedicating yourself to. Not for me, not for Michael, but for yourself." The letter left her speechless. Edward, even knowing everything that had happened, still offered her a chance at redemption, but the idea of starting over felt daunting, almost impossible. While Susan wrestled with her internal struggles, Michael found renewed strength in Edward's teachings. He began giving talks at local schools, sharing his journey and the importance of using time wisely. During one of these talks, a young woman approached him, curious about Edward. "I feel like I know your father, even though I never met him. He seems amazing." Michael smiled, a mix of pride and longing filling his heart. He was. "Everything I do now is to honor him." These moments of connection helped Michael move forward, but his relationship with Susan remained a source of pain. He knew Edward wanted them to find a way to understand each other, but he wasn't ready to take that step. Susan, in turn, began attending a support group for people grappling with regret and loss. There she met others facing their own inner battles, and for the first time, she felt she wasn't completely alone. During one session, a woman named Clara shared a story that struck a chord with Susan. "Sometimes you can't fix what's broken, but that doesn't mean you can't learn to live with the pieces." Those words stayed with Susan. She realized she was trying to rebuild something that might never be whole again, but she could still find meaning in what remained. The void left by Michael, however, was impossible to ignore. Susan started writing letters to him, hoping that one day he might read them. Each letter was a confession, an attempt to explain her choices, and a heartfelt apology. Meanwhile, Michael's work began receiving widespread recognition. He was invited to present his device at a national conference, an opportunity that thrilled him, but also filled him with nerves. He wished Edward could be there to see him. On the day of the conference, as he prepared to take the stage, Michael received an unexpected message from Susan. It was brief but deeply emotional. "Your father would be so proud of you today, and so am I, even if you don't want to hear that from me. Good luck." Michael didn't reply, but the words lingered in his mind. During his presentation, he spoke about the impact Edward had on his life and the value of time. "My father taught me that time is like a clock. Every piece, every second matters. It's our responsibility to use it to create something meaningful." The presentation was a success, but more importantly, it was a moment of catharsis for Michael. He felt he was finally honoring his father's legacy in a way that made sense to him. As Michael focused on his career, Susan continued trying to find a new direction for her life. She began volunteering at a local shelter, helping women facing hardships. It wasn't an attempt at redemption, but a way to use the time she had left for something meaningful. In the months that followed, the distance between Susan and Michael remained, but there were signs that things could change. Susan continued to send occasional letters and messages, and Michael, though still hesitant, began reading some of them. One afternoon, while organizing Edward's belongings at his grandparents' house, Michael found an old photo of their family. It was from a day at the lake when he was a child. They were all smiling, even Susan. He wondered if he could ever see her that way again, or if the past was something that could never truly be recovered. Michael woke up every morning with the feeling that he needed to do more. The success of his prosthetic project was a milestone, but he knew Edward would have encouraged him not to stop there. There was something more he needed to achieve, something greater that would further connect him to what his father represented. Meanwhile, Susan took small steps to rebuild her life. Her work at the shelter had become an important part of her routine, not just a distraction, but a way to fill the void left by her choices. Working alongside women facing real adversity, Susan began to understand the complexity of regret and resilience. One day at the shelter, Susan met a young woman named Elena, who vaguely reminded her of Michael as a teenager. Elena had fled an abusive home and was trying to rebuild her life, but insecurity and fear held her back. Susan felt drawn to her story, not out of pity but from a genuine desire to help. "No one can change the past, Elena," Susan said during a conversation as they organized donations. "But what you do today can change how you see the past." Those words weren't just for Elena, they were for herself too. Each day at the shelter became an opportunity to challenge herself to be better, even if she knew some things could never be fully repaired. At the same time, Michael was expanding his skills. He became more involved in technological projects and received an offer to work at a prestigious lab. Instead of accepting immediately, he decided to take a pause and reflect on what he truly wanted. During this time, he returned to his grandparents' house and began restoring some of Edward's unfinished inventions. One night in the workshop, Michael found a project that captured his attention. It was a sketch of a clock similar to the one Edward had left, but with a unique feature. The face didn't display traditional hours, but words like family, forgiveness, and purpose. Michael was fascinated by the concept. He decided to complete the project as a way to honor Edward, but also as a personal challenge. As he worked on the clock, Michael reflected on what his father had tried to teach him and Susan. The letters, the messages, and the original clock were reminders that time was more than just a resource. It was an opportunity. Susan, on her own journey, felt that despite all her efforts, the weight of her choices still hung over her. Her relationship with Michael remained distant, but she didn't give up trying to reconnect. During a quiet moment at the shelter, she decided to write another letter to him. This time she didn't apologize or try to justify her mistakes. She simply shared a memory. "Michael, I remember when you were 7 and we built that cardboard boat in the backyard. You insisted on painting it blue because you said it was the color of the sky and the sea, and you wanted the boat to be as free as they were. I know I haven't always been the mother you deserved, but I want you to know that I've always loved you. Even in my worst moments, that never changed." Michael received the letter and read it carefully. It brought a tightness to his chest, but also a small opening that hadn't been there before. The memory Susan described brought back a fragment of a simpler time, when he still believed his family was unbreakable. A few days later, Michael decided to visit the shelter where Susan worked. He wanted to see for himself what his mother was doing, but he also felt it was time to confront his own feelings. When he arrived, he found Susan in the middle of a meeting with several women, listening attentively and offering words of encouragement. He stood at a distance, observing. When the meeting ended, Susan noticed Michael and approached him, surprised but visibly emotional. "Michael, I'm so glad you came." He nodded, remaining silent for a moment. "I wanted to see how you're doing," he finally replied. Susan invited him to tour the shelter, and Michael was impressed by what he saw. He noticed how the women trusted her, and how Susan seemed to find purpose in helping others. "I didn't expect to see you like this, Mum," Michael said as they walked outside. "Like what?" she asked nervously. "Different." Susan didn't answer immediately. "I can't change what I did, Michael, but I can try to be a better person with the time I have left." That response stayed with Michael, even after he left. He began to consider the possibility that there might be room for some form of reconciliation, even if it would take time. For Susan, the brief encounter felt like progress. She knew Michael still carried pain, but the fact that he had come to the shelter was a sign that he might be willing to take a small step toward forgiveness. Meanwhile, Michael completed the clock Edward had started. He brought it to his grandparents and placed it in their living room as a new symbol of hope and continuity. The clock didn't just measure time. It inspired anyone who saw it to think about what truly mattered. In the months that followed, Susan continued her work at the shelter, helping more women rebuild their lives. Michael, for his part, expanded his projects and gained recognition in his field. They were on separate paths, but there was an unspoken understanding that Edward's legacy continued to shape them, connecting them in ways they might never fully explain. Michael devoted himself entirely to expanding his projects. The clock he had completed at his grandparents' house had become more than a personal symbol. It was a tangible manifestation of Edward's legacy. With every new creation, Michael felt he was honoring his father in a unique way. Yet something continued to weigh on him. The words from the letters in the original clock, the messages Edward had left not just to confront Susan, but also him. No matter how busy Michael kept himself, his father's words lingered in his mind. He knew there was something he needed to do to close that chapter of his life, though he couldn't yet pinpoint what it was. Susan, on the other hand, was in a period of deep reflection. The brief encounter with Michael at the shelter had ignited a spark of hope, but also forced her to confront the reality that the road to forgiveness would be long and arduous. While she continued her work at the shelter, there were nights when she sat alone in the living room, staring at the clock and wondering what more it might reveal. One of those nights brought an unexpected discovery. While reorganizing old documents, Susan found an envelope she had never noticed before. It was addressed to her in Edward's handwriting. Inside was a simple note. "Susan, if you've come this far, it's because something in you is still searching for purpose. Don't forget that time is a gift, not a guarantee. Use it well, not for me, but for yourself and for those still by your side." The message struck a deep chord within Susan. Edward, even knowing her faults, still believed she could find redemption, not through apologies or forced reconciliation, but through the act of creating something meaningful with the time she had left. With that in mind, Susan began planning a charity event at the shelter. She wanted to use her organizational skills to raise funds and expand the services available to the women they supported. It wasn't just a way to fill her days. It was an effort to create something valuable beyond herself. While Susan worked on the event, Michael received an unexpected invitation. A technology institute in Indianapolis invited him to speak about his journey and inventions. Though he was excited about the opportunity, the idea of returning to the city where everything had unfolded left him uneasy. He turned to Margaret, his grandmother, who always seemed to have the right words to steady him. "Michael, sometimes the only way to move forward is to revisit what's been left behind. You don't need to do this for anyone but yourself." Her advice stayed with Michael as he weighed his decision. Finally, he chose to accept the invitation. He knew the event would be a milestone, not just in his career, but in his personal journey. When the day of Susan's charity event arrived, she was nervous. It was the first time in years she felt that something depended entirely on her efforts. Everything seemed in place. The tables were set, guests were arriving, and speeches were ready. Susan didn't expect an unexpected visitor, Michael. He arrived carrying an envelope. Without a word, he handed it to her before joining the other guests. Inside the envelope was a letter from him. "Mum, I know you're trying. I know the path you're on now is different from the one you took before. I won't lie. It still hurts to think about everything that happened, but I also know that holding on to that pain won't take me anywhere. What you're doing now matters, not just to me, but to yourself. Don't forget that." Susan read the letter with tears in her eyes. It was a sign that while full forgiveness might still be far off, there was a real possibility of reconciliation. As the event continued, Susan realized that actions spoke louder than any words she could say. Her work at the shelter wasn't just a path to personal redemption, it was a way to honor the time Edward had invested in her and the potential he believed was possible. Michael watched from a distance. He observed Susan interact with the guests and lead the event with a determination that seemed almost new. While he still harbored resentment, he couldn't deny that his mother was changing. The event was a success, raising enough funds to guarantee the shelter could expand its operations for the next 2 years. Susan felt a profound sense of fulfillment, but also a serenity she hadn't experienced in years. The next day, Michael took the stage at the technology conference. He spoke about his journey, his inventions, and most importantly, Edward. "My father always believed that time is our most precious resource. He used every moment he had to create something meaningful, and that's what I try to do every day." After the talk, Michael received warm applause and praise, but what stood out most was a message he found on his phone shortly after. It was from Susan. "Your father would be so proud of you today, and so am I." Though brief, Susan's message represented something greater, a bridge being built brick by brick between what had been lost and what could still be reclaimed. Susan, upon hearing about Michael's successful presentation, felt a pride she could hardly express. She knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, she felt she was headed in the right direction. The sound of the clock's pendulum no longer echoed through the living room, as it once had. Since Susan had turned the final key and witnessed Edward's last message, the clock had fallen silent. It didn't need to speak anymore. Its message had been delivered, clear and irrevocable. But the impact of Edward's words lived on, shaping the decisions Susan and Michael made as they walked separate paths, still intertwined by Edward's legacy. The event that would finally bring them together came almost unexpectedly. A technology exhibition in Indianapolis was celebrating young inventors and honoring local pioneers who had made significant contributions to the field. Michael was invited to be the keynote speaker, his name gaining prominence in the industry. During the planning, the curators decided to include a special tribute to Edward Reed, highlighting his projects and the profound influence he had on his son's life. Michael enthusiastically accepted the invitation, but he didn't anticipate how much the exhibition would reopen old wounds. When Susan received an invitation to attend, she felt conflicted. Part of her wanted to be there to support Michael and honor Edward, but another part feared her presence would only serve as an uncomfortable reminder for her son. After much deliberation, she decided to go. She knew this wasn't about reconciliation, it was about respect. On the night of the event, the auditorium was packed. Michael stepped onto the stage with confidence, but a weight pressed on his chest. He would speak about his work, but also about his father, a topic that would inevitably force him to confront memories that still haunted him. "My father believed time was the most precious resource we have," Michael began, looking out at the crowd. "He always taught me that what we do with our time defines who we are and what we leave behind." As he spoke, he noticed Susan sitting in one of the back rows. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and he continued, feeling a knot tighten in his throat. "Edward Reed was more than my father. He was my teacher, my mentor, and the man who showed me the value of never giving up, even when life challenges us in unimaginable ways." When Michael finished his presentation, the audience gave him a standing ovation. He stepped off the stage, greeted by colleagues and admirers, but his mind was elsewhere. He saw Susan still seated, as if waiting for permission to approach. Finally, Michael walked over, and for a moment, they stood in silence. It was difficult for both of them to find words that could capture the complexity of their feelings. "You spoke beautifully," Susan said, her voice low but sincere. "Thank you," Michael replied, hesitating before adding, "I didn't know you'd be here. I wasn't sure if I should come, but this wasn't about me, it was about you and him." The silence returned, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. They were both absorbing the weight of the moment. "He would be proud of you, Michael," Susan said finally. "I am too." Michael nodded but didn't respond. He knew Susan was trying, but it didn't erase the past. Still, part of him acknowledged that her actions over the past months were more than empty gestures. The event ended, and Michael was one of the last to leave the auditorium. Susan waited in her car outside. When he finally appeared, he hesitated upon seeing her, but eventually approached. "Need a ride?" Susan asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "Yeah, I think I do." The drive was quiet but not heavy. Michael watched the city pass by through the window, while Susan focused on driving, as though keeping her hands on the wheel was the only thing holding her thoughts together. When they arrived at his grandparents' house, Michael got out but turned back before heading inside. "I still don't know how I feel about all of this," he said, breaking the silence. "But thanks for being there tonight." Susan nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "Thank you for letting me be." He walked inside, leaving Susan alone in the car. Despite everything, that brief exchange felt like a victory. She knew there was still much to overcome, but she also knew the time Edward had valued so deeply was beginning to work in her favor. In the days that followed, Michael continued his journey, increasingly immersed in new projects and initiatives. He began receiving offers to collaborate with international companies, but chose to stay in Indianapolis for now. He felt there was still something unresolved, something intrinsically tied to the clock, his grandparents' home, and what Edward had left behind. Susan, meanwhile, found a clearer purpose in her volunteer work. She began leading rehabilitation projects for women seeking to rebuild their lives, much like herself. It wasn't an act of redemption. It was a way to make the time she had left meaningful. On the second anniversary of Edward's death, Michael decided to visit Susan. He didn't notify her but arrived with a box in hand. When she opened the door, she was surprised but invited him in without hesitation. "What's this?" she asked, gesturing to the box. Michael placed it on the table and opened it, revealing the clock he had restored. "I thought you might like to have this." Susan looked at the clock, tears welling in her eyes. "It's beautiful, Michael. He would be so proud." Michael gave a small, melancholic smile. "I don't know if he'd be proud of me, but I hope so." They spent the afternoon together, talking about Edward, Michael, and even Susan's work at the shelter. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was the beginning of something that could grow with time. As Michael left, Susan stayed in the living room gazing at the clock he had brought. The gentle sound of its pendulum filled the room, but this time, it didn't feel heavy. It was a reminder that time moves forward, and that it's up to each person to decide what to do with it. The days following Michael and Susan's meeting brought subtle but meaningful changes. Michael, still deeply immersed in his career and projects, found a sense of peace in knowing Edward's teachings continued to guide him, not as a burden but as a driving force. The constant presence of his father in his memories was no longer suffocating pain, but a reminder of the responsibility to use his time meaningfully. Susan, meanwhile, faced life with a newfound honesty that she had previously lacked. Her fragile reconnection with Michael offered a glimmer of hope, though she understood that full forgiveness might never come. Her past choices, made in moments of weakness, had left indelible scars. Even so, Susan found purpose in her work at the shelter, which had grown thanks to the success of the charity event she had organized. A year after Michael's technology event, he was invited to present his work at an international convention. The opportunity validated all the effort and dedication he had poured into his projects. Before leaving, he decided to visit Susan's house, a decision he had never made of his own volition before. When he arrived, he found her in the garden, trimming plants. Susan seemed surprised to see him, but a cautious smile appeared on her face. "Michael, what brings you here?" she asked, setting her gloves aside. "I thought I should say goodbye before leaving. I'm heading to the convention tomorrow." Susan nodded, her pride evident. "I'm so happy for you. Your father, well, you know how proud he would be." Michael felt a lump in his throat but smiled. "Yeah, I know." They went inside, and Michael noticed that Edward's original clock was still in its usual place, silent but clean and well-maintained. The once ever-present sound of the pendulum no longer echoed. "You never tried to fix it?" Michael asked, curious. Susan shook her head. "No. I think it served its purpose. Some things are meant to be left as they are." Her response resonated with Michael, who realized the clock's silence was, in fact, a final lesson. Edward had said everything he needed to, and now it was up to them to decide what to do with the time they had left. That night, while packing for his trip, Michael reflected on the path he had taken. His relationship with Susan wasn't perfect, but he felt they had found a semblance of balance. He didn't know if he would ever fully forgive her, but he was beginning to accept that forgiveness was a process, not a destination. At the convention, Michael unveiled his new project, a device inspired by Edward's clock. It didn't just track time, but also served as a tool for setting priorities and goals, encouraging users to approach time more consciously. He named the device Pendulum, in honor of his father's legacy. The presentation was a resounding success, and Michael received collaboration offers from international companies. For him, however, the greatest triumph was feeling that he was finally honoring Edward in a way that made sense. Meanwhile, Susan continued to transform her life into something meaningful. The shelter flourished, and she began offering workshops for women seeking new beginnings. During one session, she met a particularly discouraged young woman. As they talked, Susan realized her own story could serve as an example, not of perfection, but of possibility. "I've made mistakes I can never undo," Susan told the young woman. "But what I've learned is that regret doesn't have to be a burden. It can be a guide, a way to find what truly matters." Susan's words had an immediate impact. The young woman began attending the workshops regularly and eventually rebuilt her life. This small triumph marked a turning point for Susan, who realized that even in her solitude, she could still make a positive difference. On the 5th anniversary of Edward's death, Susan and Michael decided to hold a small memorial in his honor. It was a simple gathering with only Michael's grandparents and a few close friends. They placed flowers on Edward's grave and shared stories that highlighted his character and dedication. As they stood at the gravesite, Michael placed a hand on Susan's shoulder. "He wouldn't have been the man he was without you." Susan looked at her son, surprised and deeply moved. "I don't know if that's true, Michael, but thank you for saying it." They spent the rest of the day together, reminiscing about happy moments and sharing stories. It wasn't complete reconciliation, but it was an important step towards something that could grow stronger over time. In the years that followed, both Susan and Michael continued to live their lives in ways that honored Edward. Michael became a respected inventor, creating devices that helped people worldwide. He carried with him the lessons his father had instilled, always remembering that time was the most precious resource of all. Susan, meanwhile, accepted her solitude as a consequence of her choices, but found peace in knowing she was using her remaining time for something meaningful. Edward's clock remained in her living room, silent but full of significance. In the end, Edward's legacy was not just the clock or the letters he left behind. It was the impact he had on Susan and Michael's lives, an influence that would continue to shape and inspire them for many years to come. Hey there, do you think Edward did the right thing? Share your opinion in the comments. We'd love to know. And if you missed the previous story, here's what happened. After suffering a severe accident that nearly took his life, a successful businessman became a prisoner of his own body, unable to speak or move, yet fully conscious. To his greatest shock, in a moment of clarity, he overheard his beloved wife speaking on the phone with her lover. They were planning to disconnect his life support to gain their freedom and claim the businessman's entire inheritance. However, the wife could never have imagined that this cruel act would come at a very high price. Follow the entire unfolding of this story right now. Click on the video appearing on your screen. See you there.